Welcome back into the Pick and Roll NBA podcast with Jet and Sap, presented by Full Press Coverage. Nothing really has happened in the NBA offseason since we've talked in the last week, except for a couple of monster trades and an NBA draft. That's all, Sap, is that the landscape of the NBA just never rests. It's constantly changing. The Celtics have a completely new look as they've traded Marcus Smart and acquired Kristaps Porzingis. The Golden State Warriors get Chris Paul, and the San Antonio Spurs apparently have drafted the greatest player of all time, if you believe all the hype for Victor Wembanyama. So, Sap, a lot of stuff going on in the NBA in just the past week.
These are just the appetizers, right? Leading up to July 1st when free agency is official, and there'll be more deals being made. And you see these teams trying to shape themselves for next season. And I think a reason that you see so many moves, and you have the last several years, is that the league is more wide open now than it's ever been. You know, there was a period of time where Jordan dominated the 90s, and Shaq, Kobe, and Duncan dominated the early 2000s, and then LeBron was constantly in the finals, oftentimes against Steph Curry and Kevin Durant and the Golden State Warriors. Now it's wide open because you've had 5 different teams win the last 5 championships. So going into 2023, 2024, there's probably a dozen teams that say, hey, if we make the right move, if we remain healthy, if a couple of young players grow, we can make a run at winning a championship. So that's why you'll see a lot of these moves. Also, you factor in that the new CBA is going into effect, and it's going to be difficult to overpay and expand your roster to the point the way Golden State did for years, where they would just overpay everyone and end up paying penalties, taxes, fines, whatever, and they could write those big checks to cover that. Because now, if they do that again, those big checks are going to be that much bigger, and even the Golden State Warriors are, scaling back a little bit. But I know the big deal that started off last week was, of course, Marcus Smart going to Memphis for 2 first-round picks, and then the Celtics were able to flip Mike Muscala along with Danilo Gallinari and some other pieces there to bring in Kristaps Porzingis. And we talked about it. You're a big Marcus Smart guy. I'm not. I love the deal, but I know you have some reservations about it.
Yeah, we did a relatively instant reaction to it on Live Take Sports. So you want to make sure you're downloading that app and following us there, as we do a show weekly there. It kind of just came out of the blue, Sap, out of nowhere. Not Porzingis, but Smart. The Porzingis thing had been rumored for a bit, and that day, essentially, it was more or less confirmed by Woj that Malcolm Brogdon was going to go to the Clippers, Porzingis was going to come to the Celtics, and Marcus Morris was going to go to the Wizards as kind of cap ballast, and so they could get out from under contracts because the Wizards are completely doing a teardown. And so I think most Celtics fans, myself included, were completely on board with that, saying, okay, Brogdon was really good for the Celtics last year, won 6th man of the year, struggled in the playoffs because he was hurt. But it was just on the Celtics for 1 year, so I think people were looking at it as, okay, yeah, that's an upgrade. We could use a big man, a presence in the middle. Porzingis is somebody that just came off of the best year of his career in Washington last year. And then the deal fell apart late, and the Celtics had to kind of go back to the drawing board with just the Wizards. And then it ended up being Marcus Smart who was out the door and not Malcolm Brogdon. And so it was just the way it happened, Sap, was just very abrupt. I don't think anybody was expecting Marcus Smart to be the one that headed out the door. He was the longest tenured member of the Celtic, arguably the most popular player on the team amongst the fan base, maybe also the least popular player amongst the fan base too. But
most polarizing for sure, right? We can agree on that.
Sure, but the fact that there was no rumor or anything, and he just got sent out of town, and people were just sort of taken off guard. And I think people are still processing the whole move right now, as are some of his teammates on the Celtics. So it was just a very surprising trade, not in what the Celtics got, because they had been rumored to want Porzingis, but that Marcus Smart was the one that was sent away.
They had to move salary, obviously, to equal what Porzingis is going to make, $36 million. So Muscala and Gallinari were contract feeder, fillings, whatever you want to call it. Marcus Smart was the bigger part of that to equal the money. Then you get 2 first-round picks, which the one this year you turn into 5 future second-round picks which is just mind-numbing to me. Like, I don't even know who keeps track of future first and second round picks going forward in this league, because it's really ridiculous, to be honest with you. And I know we're going to talk about the NBA draft a little bit later in the podcast. But look, I think Porzingis is going to give the Celtics a new look. They needed some size, because you really can't count on Rob Williams or Al Horford, especially at Horford's advanced age. And Porzingis can give you, some help on the boards. He's not a great rebounder, but he averaged more than 8 rebounds per game. He's a versatile offensive player, can score in the low post, mid-range, can even hit threes. All the numbers say that he's a good defender, especially against the pick and roll, which they struggled against in the postseason last year. And I just think it was time to move on from Marcus Smart to allow Tatum and Brown to become the leaders of this team. And that, as each year went by, I think Smart's value would go down, because now he's a 30-year-old player with a lot of tread on those tires that have been worn. And I think they got as much as they could for him. It doesn't sound like a lot, 2 first-round picks, but, they needed to do this to get the cap relief, because once Brogdon wasn't going to the Clippers, they had to put in one of their other point guards to make this work, and it was either going to be Derek White or Marcus Smart. And White's probably their most versatile guard, because he can do a lot of things that Smart does, but he's a better three-point shooter and more durable guy at this stage. So they had to move on at that point. And now they're kind of stuck with Malcolm Brogdon. What do you do with him? Do you have the conversation and say, well, we'd love to have you back? I mean, that's going to be a tough conversation with Brad Stevens and Malcolm Brogdon. Or do you now that you have a little breathing room, you're not up against the deadline, that you can move Malcolm Brogdon for a wing, draft picks, whatever it may be?
Yeah, I mean, the roster's still not complete, right? I don't think that you can look at it and say, okay, the Celtics, this is what the roster is going to look like on opening night, and feel like it's a roster that you can feel really confident about, because they haven't addressed the issues that as to why they got bounced in the conference finals this past season, and in the NBA finals, 2 seasons ago to the Warriors. And that's, the toughness aspect that they lack, that sort of mental and sometimes honestly physical toughness, Sap. And something that we brought up a lot during the trade deadline that they didn't address, and that kind of came back to haunt them a little bit, is wing depth, of which they have none. So I have a hard time imagining this is what the roster is going to look like. They still have a decision to make on Grant Williams, who's a restricted free agent, and sort of now with Porzingis becomes a little redundant that they don't really need him, but he is a talented player, even though for God knows what reason he was out of the Celtics playoff rotation. Joe Mazzulla didn't want to play him for a long period of time. Not sure what that was about, but it's hard in the NBA to let players of value walk for nothing. So maybe they work a signing trade, but they still need to address reasons they got eliminated, Sap. And yeah, okay, Porzingis gives them a certainly a better scoring option than Smart as a third scoring option, and he can play in the middle and maybe help be a little bit of a zone breaker a little bit more. But there's that mental toughness thing they still need to address, and they need to address wing depth behind Tatum and Brown, because that really, like I said, came back to haunt them. So I don't think Brad Stevens is done. It seems hard to imagine that this is what the roster is going to look like on opening night, Sap.
No, there'll be some additions, whether it be through free agency, some future trades, maybe trades during the season. And again, I think every team right now is just planning ahead year to year, or actually a few years ahead, because of what the salary cap's going to look like and what the penalties are going to look like, because you've got a little breathing room this year. Porzingis is going to make $36 million. Jaylen Brown, his Supermax deal, if offered to him, would not go into effect till next season. And then Jason Tatum's Supermax deal would not go into effect till the following season. But, by 2025, 26, which isn't that far away. It sounds like it's a long way away, but it's not. The Celtics would be committed to like $160 million a year for just 3 players. So essentially they'd have those 3 guys, like me, you, and some other guys off the street, to fill out the roster. And you can't really run a franchise like that unless you want to pay these exorbitant taxes and fines, which the Celtics don't want to do. I don't think they have the cash flow to do that, to be quite honest. I mean, Steve Ballmer can do that, or Golden State's ownership can do that, and even they're scaling back at this point, because look, it's still a business to these owners, and they don't want to write a $200 million check to the league because they overpaid and they went for a championship and it didn't work out. And
Right.
now you're stuck with all of these taxes. So I think that there are going to be more moves made by the Celtics. They do need to address a little wing depth so that you have some versatility there to give Tatum and Brown a breather, although Porzingis, I think, can do some of those things. So on a given night, if Porzingis and Brown are on, maybe Tatum can rest a little bit. The next game, maybe Brown takes off and Tatum and Porzingis put up 55 points combined. Now you have that third scorer, which you didn't have last year. As good as Malcolm Brogdon, Derek White, and those other players are, they're not true scorers the way Porzingis is.
Sure, Porzingis has been a number one option on teams before. And he's most comfortable as a second or third option, which he was again last year in Washington. Had the best season of his career. He was the number 2, sometimes number 3 option. Bradley Beal was 1, Kuzma sometimes, and Porzingis alternated between the second and third primary scorer on that team. So in terms of Porzingis and the fit, I think if he fits really well in the Celtics, they're not going to ask him to do something that he's not capable of doing or not comfortable of doing, and he gives them something that they didn't have before. But they're still lacking other pieces, Sap, and that's sort of where I'm giving the trade sort of an incomplete grade. Is I need to see how they fill out the rest of the roster, not just in terms of basketball fits, but in terms of personality. Like I heard they're rumored for Patrick Beverley. Perfect. I know you might have your problems with Patrick Beverley because he didn't mesh great with the Lakers and LeBron Sap, but they need they need some a-holes on the team, honestly. And they lost one of them in Marcus Smart, and they need guys who will get in other teams' face, especially when they foul Jason Tatum or Jaylen Brown hard, because those guys aren't willing to do it. So yeah, there's a lot of fallout to still happen from this Celtics trade. Definitely a lot of shocked fans in Boston, as again Marcus Smart was incredibly popular and the longest tenured member of the team. But that wasn't the only big trade that happened, as the Wizards again just tearing everything down to the studs. Had Chris Paul for about a week as a result of the Bradley Beal trade, but they redirect him to Golden State for Jordan Poole. So Golden State now has arguably the 2 greatest point guards of their generation in Chris Paul and Steph Curry on the roster. Sap, I kind of like this trade for both teams.
Yeah, I mean, Jordan Poole's going to go nuclear in Washington because they're going to be headed to the draft lottery. Right. They're going to be terrible, but he may score 26, 27 points per game. I doubt that he'll make all NBA first, second, or third team. He's not that good.
He won't be efficient, but it'll be a lot of points.
He'll put a lot of points on the board. Yeah, Shai Gilgeous-Alexander was first team All NBA for a team that was only in the play-in. I don't think that Jordan Poole's as good as Shai Gilgeous-Alexander, but you get my point that he'll put 25, 26 points per game up there. He'll be happy. They won't win. Gallinari, Muscala, maybe the rest of the Italian national team will end up in Washington and do some nice things for the Wizards as they'll finish 14th in the Eastern Conference. But as far as Golden State, this is going to be interesting to see because here's Chris Paul now, who's turned into basketball Ricky Henderson, who is played on like every team in the league. It feels like he's been on 3 teams since Denver won the championship 2 weeks ago, right? He was on Phoenix, went to Washington, true. And now he's with Golden State. Is something going to happen before the season starts where they move on from Chris Paul? It's just they're all moving his contract around. We're also going to have to see what Golden State does with Draymond Green. And I think they're going to keep Draymond Green, probably work on a 4-year, $80 million deal. He could have opted in for $27 million for this year, but I think he wants a longer-term deal to stay with the Golden State Warriors now that his nemesis Jordan Poole is out. I think he'll be free to be himself, although Draymond's always himself. Punches be damned at the head of Jordan Poole. But what does Golden State do in terms of Curry and Paul? Do they play them together? I mean, you could see a starting lineup. This is what I would do if I was Golden State. Just again, try it out. It's an 82-game schedule. If it doesn't work out, you got other games to try, other combinations. But you could have Chris Paul, Steph Curry, Klay Thompson, a 3-man backcourt essentially. You could have Andrew Wiggins and Kevon Looney as your one big, and then you could have Draymond Green as your 6th man. I think Draymond Green is perfectly suited to be a 6th man. Now, is he going to accept that? I think he will because he came off the bench a few times with Golden State in the postseason this year. And his role is to be that glue guy. And as a 6th man, he can come in, give you that energy, give you the defense. He's an outstanding passer. He sets screens. He can kind of read the game and then see what the team needs. And you go from there. The problem with Golden State is they had 3 high draft picks over a 2-year period, and they misfired on all of them so far. mean, James Wiseman spent 2 years with Golden State. Now he's with Detroit. And then Kuminga and Moody just haven't really developed in their young careers. So they had an opportunity to really add young talent, and it just didn't work out. Actually, their best draft pick was Jordan Poole, who's now gone.
Right.
But yeah, this is going to be fascinating to see Chris Paul, if healthy and it vibes well, he could lead the league in assists because there's going to be Curry and Thompson coming off a lot of screens, getting a lot of opportunities to catch and shoot with a great passer like Chris Paul. And there'll be some lob opportunities for perhaps Looney or Wiggins and some other offensive opportunities for the rest of the players. This could work. It's going to be fascinating to watch as Chris Paul continues to ring chase at this point.
Yeah, I think that, man, what a roller coaster of emotions for Chris Paul. Is on a title contender in the Suns, playing with Durant and Devin Booker, and then gets traded to the worst team in the league, probably in the Wizards, and then he gets traded to the Golden State Warriors all in the span of like a week and a half, 2 weeks, Sap. So yeah, a lot of I think up and down emotions for Chris Paul. The reason I like the trade for both teams. Well, for Washington, they're awful. They have to pay somebody. They have to reach, a cap floor. And so Poole doesn't have a great contract, but, he's young and can score and is a name people recognize. So he could potentially sell some jerseys and put some butts in seats in what's going to be a very long and painful rebuilding process in DC. And so, why not for them? And for the Warriors, more so than getting the player, Chris Paul, I think just getting Poole off the team and, bringing in Draymond back, because I assume that's what's going to happen, is probably a good addition by subtraction. And I also think Poole, once he signed that big contract, started believing his own hype a little bit, and his shot selection wasn't really smart. You definitely can't be taking shots away from Steph Curry and Klay Thompson, and that was happening. I remember in the playoffs, there was a big opportunity. I forget what round it was in Sep, but the ball should have seen Curry and Steph Poole took a 30-foot 3-pointer, at the end of the game that rimmed out. So I think that maybe addition by subtraction for Golden State, and the Chris Paul, the fit is interesting. Like, he's a tremendous floor general. We know this, Sap. He's great at finding guys assisted on threes, but also the Warriors like to play that up tempo, and Chris Paul, at his age, isn't going to want to be sprinting up and down the court. So I'm very curious to see how they use him. Because, Curry has been the primary ball handler, but comes off screens too. Is Chris Paul going to run sort of a traditional offense? So they're going to want to do with him, with guys running off screens and him finding them? Is he going to come off the bench? I don't know what they're going to do for him, Sap, but I do think it's going to be fascinating to see.
Well, he worked well with James Harden, so he played off the ball somewhat with James Harden in his 2 years with Houston. It looked uncomfortable at times, but look, they were successful. They got to the Western Conference Finals in their first year together and had a 3-2 lead over Golden State. And in that fifth game, we know Chris Paul's hamstring went, and then Golden State was able to come back and win games 6 and 7 after trailing by double digits. He also played for Mike D'Antoni, so that was more of a fast-paced type of offense. Again, didn't always look comfortable, but he's such a smart player and has pretty much seen and done everything in the NBA except win a championship, that I think he'll be able to adapt. So he can play off the ball a little bit. Steph can maybe handle the ball, but let's not forget, when Draymond's in the game, you can run your offense through Draymond there.
Yeah.
That's just the way their offense works. It's not, point guard centric in that sense. So I think it can certainly work. I mean, they've got incredibly high basketball IQ. I mean, when you've got Draymond Green, Steph Curry, Klay Thompson, and Chris Paul on the court together, and there'll be times when those 4 guys will be on the court together, that is basketball nirvana in terms of a high IQ. So I think they'll be able to figure it out. And you've got a great coach in Steve Kerr, who I know will move the pieces around where need be. The big question is, that's an old team, right? I mean, you're talking about 38-year-old Chris Paul, 35-year-old Steph Curry. Klay and Draymond are now 32, 33, respectively. So, there's 4 guys that, maybe early in the season they're going to look spectacular, but as the season unfolds and you get to the postseason, will they have much left in the tank because of their advanced age? That's going to be a big question.
Yeah. And again, I think it's going to be interesting to see too. Chris Paul and Draymond Green do have a history together too. Not exactly the biggest fans of each other. Steve Kerr and Chris Paul have had some exchanges too, but Chris Paul is all about trying to win a championship at this point in his career. That's
Mm-hmm.
eluded him his whole career. So I don't think he'll ruffle any feathers, at least for his first season in there. The pecking order is pretty clear in Golden State. It's not Chris Paul's team. It is Steph Curry's team. And if it's Steph Curry's out, it's Clay's team. If it's not Clay's out, it's Draymond's team. It's so, it's very, very obvious where Chris Paul fits in terms of the pecking order of that team. And we'll have to see how it happens, how everything goes down. But I'm fascinated to see it too. Sap, a trade also that we even forgot to mention that happened was because it was a salary dump, but still a relatively big name player, was that the Atlanta Hawks sent John Collins to the Utah Jazz for Rudy Gay, which is, again, salary cap ballast at this point. Rudy Gay isn't a useful NBA player at this point really anymore, other than
How
maybe
old is Rudy Gay? I think I was in
I don't
high
know.
school when he entered the league. He's ancient, right? But
Yeah, but maybe he's a good locker room leader. I don't know, but it was a salary dump for the
right.
Hawks because of every team is so worried about this new CBA. And we'll do a podcast on the new CBA at a later date because it's starting to really affect how teams do what they do. So kind of explaining that a little bit more. But the Jazz and Danny Ainge does what he likes to do, which is give up essentially nothing and get a valuable asset. So John Collins, I think just 25 years old still, very solid NBA player. Sometimes at points in his career has been a borderline all-star. Took a bit of a step back the past season or two, but he'll have plenty of opportunity to play in Utah. And the Jazz gave up very little, essentially nothing to get him. So if he has a rebound year and plays really well, again, he's still got room to grow in his career. Great, the Jazz can either keep him or trade him for more than what they traded away. So I think a home run trade for the Utah Jazz. And for the Hawks, they're sort of trying to restructure what they're doing on the fly. And I think that that run they had to the conference finals was great, but they're realizing that this is not a team that's going to be competitive for a championship in the East as is currently constituted.
Yeah, Collins has been rumored to be on the move from Atlanta for what, 3 years, or
Yeah,
even before
most of
that.
his career. Yeah,
Right. It was always a guy who was good enough to trade, good enough that you wanted to keep. That there's a ton of those players in the league. Like they do offer value on the open market, but they're also good enough that you think they could be the third or fourth best player on a contending team. Never quite worked out, but yeah, he's a valuable piece. He's much younger than Rudy Gay, so Utah's, along with Laurie Markkinen, have now a couple of players that are pretty versatile. You can kind of build through there. And Danny Ainge has 1 million draft picks. I don't know if it's necessarily a free agent destination, but if you pay the players, they'll go. Again, because of how all of these teams are now looking at their dollars and cents, I think it even opens up the free agent market for more franchises than in the past, where every free agent was rumored to go to where? Miami, the Lakers, the Clippers, and a few other teams. Maybe that's even opening up because teams just can't spend like they used to unless they
right.
want to pay these crazy taxes.
Yeah. Again, so we'll talk about the CBA more at a later date and how it's affecting everybody, but it is really starting to affect all the transactions teams make, with the exception of the Phoenix Suns, who just seem like they're going to just write blank checks to the league and don't really give a damn, what their contract situations are. So that was interesting, but there's also there's Damian Lillard stuff going on, but I don't really feel like talking about that, Sap, because he's been hemming and hawing for 3 years now. So until we have concrete news on Damian Lillard, we'll talk about that at a later date. But
he officially is basketball Hamlet, right? Like to stay or not to stay, that is
right.
the question. Like it changes on a weekly or monthly basis.
I can't deal with it anymore. It's just
well, he's kind of like Brett Favre 15 years ago, or Aaron Rodgers the last 3 years. Like, is he going to stay there? Is he going to try to be part of a rebuild? Does he want to go to another franchise and chase a championship? Is Portland going to go all in and maybe try to get a free agent, make a big deal? Yeah, it is exhausting, to be honest with you. It's almost like when something happens, let us know, and then we'll talk about it.
Exactly. So that's the approach we're going to take on this show, which leads us to the NBA draft. Sap, happened last Thursday, and I know you had a lot of thoughts about it. I always watch the whole thing and watched with my dad for every year since I can remember. And this year, had highs and lows, but I have some complaints about how the NBA puts it on. But I'm going to let you kick it off, Sap.
Well, the whole thing is it's changed so much, and I don't want to sound like the angry old guy. I mean, I'm 60 years old, so I remember when Bill Walton was the first overall pick in the 1974 draft. I mean, that's how old I am. And, he'd won 2 championships at UCLA. Portland had the first pick. They took him, and within 3 years, they won a championship. But Victor Wembanyama, the first pick, obviously going to San Antonio, in my lifetime, well, I'm going to include when I was 6 or 7 years old, but in my lifetime, because I was alive, there have been now 4 players who were considered can't miss prospects, and we heard about them for several years leading up to the draft. So there was the then Lou Alcindor, who was with the UCLA Bruins, won 3 straight national championships, only played 3 years because you couldn't play as a freshman. And he was obviously the number 1 overall pick by the Milwaukee Bucks in 1969. 1983, Ralph Sampson was the first overall pick. He spent 4 years at Virginia, didn't win a national championship, was 3-time collegiate player of the year. He went to the Houston Rockets, and after 3 or 4 really great years, injuries derailed his career. Then, of course, we have LeBron James in 2003 coming out of high school, going to Cleveland, and now Victor Wembanyama this year with the San Antonio Spurs. The problem with this draft is, if you were alive back in 1969, so I can barely remember it, your dad's a little older than me, you saw a lot of the then Lou Alcindor, right? Because he was constantly on TV. They were winning national championships. You knew about him in high school. So by the time he got to the NBA, everyone knew how great this guy was going to be, and you can make a case he's the greatest player in the history of the sport. He's certainly in the discussion. Ralph Sampson, we saw Virginia for 4 years. Now, it was somewhat disappointing because they never broke through and won a national championship, but he was great. And you waited. Houston got the pick. You knew all about Ralph Sampson when he entered the NBA. LeBron, we saw his high school games, for God's sakes, on ESPN back in the 2002, 2003 season. Dick Vitale was doing some of those games on ESPN. So when he got to Cleveland, we had a good idea that this guy's going to be special. Have we seen Victor Wembanyama play other than occasional games against teams from the G League? I mean, unless you go on YouTube and watch French professional basketball, we don't know much about this guy other than, he's 7'5", he's highly skilled, all of this great stuff. So here he is, and it's like this big secret, like this unknown prize that San Antonio won. And then to make matters worse, after the 3rd pick, who the hell were the guys getting drafted? It was the Thompson twins. I thought that was a group from the 80s. It was like all these guys were being selected, and no one really knew much about them because they didn't really play in college, these players, because they were playing either the G League or overseas. And all the players on Connecticut that were part of a national championship team went later in the draft,
Right.
It's frustrating. That's all I'm saying, is that these players that I think are going to be some sensational players in the league, we just don't have a connection to any of these guys, right? Like when Magic was the first overall pick in 1979, we saw the guy win a national championship 3 months before that against Larry Bird, and they entered the league together, and you were psyched to see that. Who are these people? Even Scoot Henderson, who, may be a fabulous player. I mean, it seems like his sisters are more famous than him. Well, especially in terms of Stephen A. Smith, who couldn't stop, gawking at them on draft night. He was more interested in the sisters than in Scoot Henderson. But the whole thing was who are these people? It almost felt like the baseball draft when guys get drafted and you go, I've heard of the guy, but I've never seen him play.
Yeah, I mean, the first thing I would say is people are going to have to get used to it because it's the new world order in terms of how that's going to go. These players are going to come from foreign countries more and more often, so it's going to be harder to watch their games. The league, I think, did a good job trying to get players or fans familiar with Victor Wembanyama by they acquired all the rights, the streaming rights to all of his games. So you could watch them if you wanted to on NBA.com. But like I said, more foreign players, and you're gonna have more players foregoing college because even though there's NIL money, there's still more money to be made now playing for the G League Ignite or Overtime Elite. Which is basically a prep school, which is where the Thompson twins went, and a lot of other players who got drafted. It's a monetary calculus now, and it's also a comfortability calculus. Some of these guys don't want to have to put in the academic work to go to a year of college, even though it may not be that much. They just don't want to do it. I can't blame them. School isn't my favorite either. So yeah, the NBA is going to have to find ways and to continue to promote these guys who get drafted because they're not going to be household names, because if they go to college, it's going to be just for 1 year. And if they, the highest guy who was a senior who was taken was Jaime Jaquez Jr. went to UCLA, and he was, I think, the 18th pick by the Miami Heat. So you're not going to see many guys that you're familiar with in college until after the lottery, certainly, and late in the first round. So I get what you're saying there, Sap. In terms of my thoughts on the draft is the NBA is such a forward-thinking, progressive league, typically, but they have stayed with these like archaic draft rules with the hats and and Adam Silver or announcing the trades 45 minutes after we hear about it online. Like the TV broadcast can't be so much slower than the information that's disseminating online. Like the teams know it, the players know it, the agents know it, the fans know it. So the television broadcast should reflect that. The thing with the hats is silly at this point. Like just give them the appropriate hat to the team that they were traded to, so we know where the hell these guys are going. And you don't have to have Adam Silver announce the picks. Just have Woj or somebody announce exactly what happened, when it happened, and that's it. And then throw the right logo on the screen instead of saying, well, this is going to go to this team by way of this team. It's very confusing to follow. And there are older NBA fans, Sap, like my dad, who were not on Twitter and not following it on Twitter too, as it progresses, and they're super confused. So they need to address that and make it be much more of a fluid broadcast that's less confusing. And the Celtics didn't have help matters by trading 100 times down, like it was Bill Belichick and the Patriots during the NFL draft. But they need to make it more accessible for people, because this year especially, it was super confusing. Like you said, a lot of players were not household names. The picks were getting dealt all over the place. The hat somebody was wearing was 3 hats before that what they actually should have had. So they need to fix some of that too. In terms of the quality of the draft, I mean, I'm sure we'll talk about the rookie class plenty this upcoming year. It seemed, and the opinion was, it was a very high quality draft class. Beyond the top 3 picks, it was less household names, but a lot of players that teams seem to be very high on. And it should be an excellent rookie class. As I imagine, Sap, and we've talked about this many times before, I don't think you're going to have weak classes coming into the NBA anymore. It's too global of a game. The football kids are not playing as much football, so the great athletes are playing basketball a lot now too. And you're not going to see crap draft classes really anymore. So I expect every draft class going forward is going to have really, really quality players up and down the draft.
The other thing too is you had 60 draft picks, right? And it felt like maybe 40% of them were in their original slot. After like the 12th or 14th pick, it was like, well, this team is trading this pick for a future pick and also
very
another
confusing
pick in the second round. Yeah, it was just like move after move after move. And maybe Woj and Shams are so darn good at their jobs, that they're just ahead of the league. They're tweeting out the picks and the moves before the league even gets a hold of it. So those two guys are outstanding at what they do. Kind of like Schefter with the NFL draft, right? It was like Schefter's telling us who's getting picked, 5 minutes before the actual selection is being made at the NFL draft. So those guys are really good. And again, where there's so much more access to information now than before. I mean, I remember covering NBA and NFL drafts that were so archaic. I mean, the NFL draft, the first one I ever covered, I think it was in 1980, was on a Tuesday morning. We had to be at the old Schaefer Stadium in Foxborough at 8 o'clock in the morning, and it was probably maybe 30 or 40 of us there, and it was just stale donuts and coffee, and then they fed us lunch later, and someone would just come out and announce the Jets with the 6th pick selected Marvin Powell or whoever went in the 1980 draft. So it's so much different now than it was then, and it's a lot better. But yeah, it was so confusing. Like, did that guy just get drafted by Milwaukee? Oh, no, wait a second. He's going to Charlotte. Oh, no, he's not going to Charlotte. He's going to Portland. And wait a second. Meanwhile, Brad Stevens, is trading a first-round pick for 5 seconds over the next 5 years. Like, who keeps track of all this stuff? It's way too confusing, especially in a society now where everyone has like attention deficit disorder. It's like, what just happened?
Yeah, so they need to, make it easier to consume for sure. And obviously that, the highlight of the draft is there, and everybody, as you mentioned, Sap, is really excited to see Victor Wembanyama play. He immediately flew to San Antonio after the draft and had dinner the following night with some Spurs legends, Sean Elliott, Manu Ginobili, David Robinson, and Tim Duncan, and made all of them look like you and me in terms of height. I mean, David Robinson and Tim Duncan easily clear 7 feet tall, and he was towering over them in that picture, Sap.
Yeah, it's incredible. 7'5". I think there's only been 25 players in the history of the league that are 7'4" or taller. He's one of them, and the only one that averaged more than 10 points per game in his career was Yao Ming. So it's going to be interesting to see how long his career is. He does seem like a special player, but obviously the Spurs were fortunate enough to win this draft lottery like they were back over 30 years ago to get David Robinson and 25 years ago to get Tim Duncan. So they are somewhat lucky when these sensational players are coming out, and good for Greg Popovich. He gets to coach what he thinks will be another great player.
Yeah. So everybody, I'm really excited to see him play. He's a very unique prospect. A lot of, I think the hype is getting a little out of control, saying it'll be disappointing if he's not better than, Hakeem Olajuwon or doesn't finish his career as a top 5 all-time player in the NBA. Like, that's in an insane amount of pressure to put on somebody who's, never played in the United States, outside of a couple of exhibition games. But it's good for the league to have these high profile international prospects, because it just helps grow the sport. So I'm excited to see him play, and the Spurs and their fan base are obviously incredibly happy. They had like a freaking parade for the guy the second he touched down in San Antonio. So yeah, it's the hype has begun, and we will see, and we'll be here to cover as much of his career as we are able, Sap, and lots of stuff still to happen in this NBA offseason that has already been so busy. As Sap mentioned at the top of the show, July 1st, free agency begins, and then more trades can happen, and ton of stuff left to go. So we will have no shortage of content here. So make sure you check out the show, check out our social medias at JohnSap25, at Jet Stryer. We'll have, all of our information on the show there, and live reactions when we can, and download Live Take Sports if you haven't already. Just go to the App Store, look for Live Take. Sap and I do a show weekly there, debate topic, and we will be doing one tomorrow around 5 o'clock Eastern, so stay tuned for that. And yeah, download the podcast wherever podcasts are found. Pick and Roll NBA podcast with Jet and Sap. Thanks to Full Press Coverage. Check out their website for all sorts of great content too. And we'll be back later talking more NBA with you guys. Thanks for listening. See ya.